My daughter stole money from my father. The words echoed through the massive dining room, cutting through the festive noise of 40 relatives gathered for our annual Christmas dinner. It was December 2023, and outside, the snow was falling heavily over our small mountain town of Cedar Hollow, Montana. Inside, the temperature felt like it had just dropped below freezing. My dad, Victor Hart, stood at the head of a long oak table. He was a former construction company owner, a man who always demanded the room's attention, and right now, he had every single ounce of it. He reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a thick red envelope, and slammed it down on the table right in front of my plate. He announced to the dead-silent room that it was a court summons. Everyone stopped eating. My aunts, uncles, cousins, and even my mom, Marilyn, and my younger brother Caleb just stared at me. 40 pairs of eyes locked onto my face, waiting for me to break down, cry, or run out of the room. I was 34 years old, working grueling shifts as an ICU nurse, and my own father was publicly declaring me a criminal in front of everyone we knew. But here's a thing Victor did not know. He had no idea that I was not surprised by his little stunt. He didn't know that 6 months ago, I had hired a financial investigator. I already knew everything. I knew exactly what he had done, and the envelope I had resting in my own bag wasn't just going to clear my name. It contained enough hard evidence to completely destroy him and the fake empire he had built on a foundation of lies and theft. To understand how we ended up in a standoff at Christmas dinner, you have to go back 12 years. The trap did not start with my grandfather's money. It started way back in 2011 with my own name and my own future that I had just graduated from nursing school. I was completely exhausted but incredibly proud. I had my whole life ahead of me, ready to start my career, get my own place, and build my independence. Then, my dad called me over to the house. He sat me down in his home office, looking stressed and defeated. He told me that his construction company was going through a massive financial rough patch. He said he was on the verge of losing everything if he did not get a cash injection immediately. Then he dropped the bomb. He needed me to co-sign a $280,000 mortgage loan. I panicked. I was fresh out of college. I barely had a paycheck yet, but he looked me dead in the eye and played the ultimate family card. He told me that family always steps up for family. He promised me, swearing up and down, that it would only be for 3 months. Just 3 months, Elena, he said. Just until the next big contract pays out, and then I will refinance and take your name right off the paperwork. You won't even notice it. I wanted to help my dad. I trusted him. So, I signed the papers. That was the biggest mistake of my life. 3 months turned into 1 year. 1 year dragged into 5 years. 5 years spiraled into 12 long, miserable years that he never took my name off that mortgage. Worse, he started paying late. At first, it was just a few days past the due date. Then it was a couple of weeks. Then the bank started calling my phone because my name was on the dotted line. Every time I called him, frantic and upset, he would brush me off. He would say things like, "Calm down, I sent the check yesterday," or "Stop overreacting, the bank always gets their money." But the damage was already being done to me. Every time he missed a payment, my credit took the hit. I was working long, exhausting shifts in the ICU, saving every penny I could to buy my own small house, but I was trapped. Whenever I applied for a loan or even a decent apartment, I was denied. My credit score tanked to an abysmal 540. I was a registered nurse with a steady income, but on paper, I looked like a massive financial liability, all because I trusted my father. I missed out on buying my own home. I was stuck living in cheap, cramped rentals, watching my 20s and early 30s slip by while my dad lived comfortably in the house I was legally on the hook for. That I was angry, but I kept my mouth shut. I just kept my head down, worked my shifts, and hoped he would eventually figure it out. Then came May 2023. My grandfather, Arthur Hart, passed away at the age of 87. He was a good man, hardworking and quiet. We all gathered for the funeral, mourning the loss of the patriarch of our family. But the grief barely had time to settle before my dad made his move. Right after the funeral, Victor gathered the immediate family. He stood in the living room and announced, very casually, that Grandpa Arthur had left his entire estate to him. The assets were massive. My grandfather owned a 40-acre farm right outside of town, 2 separate rental properties that generated steady passive income, and $610,000 in pure cash savings. It was a fortune. And according to my dad, it all belonged to him now. And no one in the room protested. My mom just nodded. My brother Caleb stayed quiet, and the rest of the family just accepted it as fact. It made sense on the surface. Victor was the oldest son, so people assumed he was the natural heir. But as I sat there listening to him talk about the money and the land, a heavy, sinking feeling hit my stomach. Something was incredibly wrong. Grandpa Arthur was a fair man. He loved all of his grandchildren equally. He had always talked about making sure we were all taken care of when he was gone. It made zero sense for him to leave absolutely everything to my dad, especially since my dad had a long, well-known history of making terrible financial decisions. But I didn't have any proof. I just had my gut feeling and the bitter memory of what my dad had done to my credit score. I kept quiet that day, watching my dad act like a king who had just inherited his castle. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought my dad would take the money, pay off the mortgage he had trapped me in for 12 years, and leave me alone. But I underestimated his greed, and I completely underestimated how far he was willing to go to cover his tracks. A week after the funeral, the whispers started that I live in a small town. In Cedar Hollow, news travels faster than a wildfire. You cannot keep a secret here, and you certainly cannot stop a rumor once it gets going. I started noticing people looking at me differently. At the grocery store, people I had known for years would suddenly turn their heads and walk down another aisle to avoid me. At first, I thought maybe it was just my imagination. I was tired from working back-to-back shifts at the hospital, dealing with critical patients, and dealing with the emotional toll of losing my grandfather. But then it became impossible to ignore. The first real incident happened at the hospital where I worked. I was grabbing a coffee in the cafeteria when I overheard two nurses talking a few tables over. They didn't see me standing there. I heard one of them mention my name, followed by the phrase, "Took advantage of the old man." My blood ran cold. I walked away before they could see me, my hands shaking so badly I spilled hot coffee on my scrubs. A few days later, I went to Sunday service at our local church, the same church my family has attended for decades. Normally, after the service, people linger in the lobby, chatting and drinking cheap coffee. I walked up to a group of women who had known me since I was a little girl playing in the church choir. The moment I approached, the conversation died instantly. They gave me tight, uncomfortable smiles, muttered quick excuses, and scattered. I finally found out what was going on when a close friend of mine pulled me aside later that week. She looked incredibly uncomfortable. She told me that my dad had been talking to our relatives, and those relatives had been talking to the whole town. Victor was telling everyone that I had stolen cash from Grandpa Arthur's safe right before he died. He wasn't just implying it. He was stating it as a fact. He was spinning a narrative that I was a desperate, broke woman who had taken advantage of a dying old man to line my own pockets. The irony was so thick it made me sick to my stomach. He was the one who had made me broke. He was the one who destroyed my credit. And now, he was using the financial ruin he caused as the motive for a crime I never committed. That I had become the town pariah, the granddaughter who stole money from the elderly. My reputation, which I had spent years building as a dedicated, caring ICU nurse, was being shredded to pieces by my own father. That I went home that night and locked the door. I sat on the floor of my cheap rental apartment, the only place I could get approved for with my 540 credit score, and I cried. I cried for my grandfather. I cried for the 12 years of financial abuse I had endured, and I cried because my family was actively trying to destroy me. But the tears didn't last long. By the time the sun came up the next morning, the sadness was completely gone. In its place was a cold, hard anger. If my dad wanted to play this game, fine. But I was not going to be his victim anymore. I decided right then and there to look into my own finances, just to make sure he hadn't done anything else to ruin my life while he was busy spreading rumors. That I opened my laptop, pulled up my bank accounts, and decided to check the mortgage account, the one I had co-signed 12 years ago. I hadn't looked at it in months because it always just caused me stress. I typed in my password, hit enter, and waited for the page to load. What I saw on that screen didn't just break my heart. It started a war. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, my eyes scanning the numbers on the bank portal. I expected to see the remaining balance of the original $280,000 loan I had co-signed 12 years ago. I expected to see the late fees that were dragging my credit score down to a miserable 540. But that was not what was sitting on the screen. There was an entirely new line item attached to the property. It was a home equity loan, and the balance was exactly $75,000. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I clicked on the details of the transaction. The loan had been finalized, and the money had been fully withdrawn just a few months prior. I felt completely numb. I had never applied for a home equity loan. I had never spoken to a bank representative. I had never seen a single piece of paperwork for this transaction. But because my name was legally tied to the house, my signature was absolutely required to borrow against the equity. The reality hit me like a physical punch. My dad had not just been making late payments and ruining my credit by accident. He had actively, intentionally forged my signature to take out another $75,000. He did not ask for my permission, and he did not even give me a heads up. He just faked my name on official bank documents, took the cash, and left me legally responsible for the debt. I closed my laptop. I did not cry this time. The sadness from the rumors and the betrayal was completely gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. Up until that exact moment, I had viewed my father as a selfish man who made terrible financial choices. Now, I saw him for what he truly was. He was a criminal. And if he was willing to commit fraud against his own daughter to get his hands on $75,000, there was absolutely no limit to what he might have done with my grandfather's estate. I realized I could not handle this on my own. I was an intensive care unit nurse, not a lawyer or an accountant. I needed professional help. The very next morning, after my 12-hour shift at the hospital, I sat in my car in the parking lot and started making phone calls. I spent hours researching professionals who specialized in unraveling financial crimes and estate fraud. That is how I found Daniel Crow. Daniel was a forensic financial investigator. He was a former auditor who now ran his own private firm specializing in tracking hidden assets and exposing white-collar fraud. I called his office, explained the absolute basics of my situation, and begged for a meeting. He agreed to see me that afternoon. I walked into his office carrying a thick folder containing the 12 years of mortgage statements, my credit reports, and the printed screenshot of the new $75,000 equity loan. I sat across from his desk and laid it all out. I told him about the original loan from 2011. I told him about my grandfather Arthur passing away at 87. I told him about my dad suddenly inheriting a 40-acre farm, 2 rental properties, and $610,000 in cash. I explained that my dad was now spreading malicious rumors around our entire town, telling everyone at my church and my hospital that I had stolen money from my grandfather's safe. Finally, I slid the paper showing the forged equity loan across the desk. Daniel listened to my entire story without interrupting. He looked at the paperwork, his expression serious and unreadable. When I finished, I told him I needed to know the truth about my grandfather's will. I needed to know exactly what my dad was doing behind closed doors. Daniel leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and told me that investigations like this take time, money, and extreme patience. He warned me that if we started digging into my family's finances, we could not undig what we found. I told him I was ready. I hired him on the spot. That decision kicked off a massive 6-month-long investigation. For the next half year, my life was split into 2 completely different worlds. In my public life, I just kept my head down. I continued working grueling shifts at the hospital, ignoring the whispers in the cafeteria and the cold shoulders at the grocery store. I let my dad continue to play the victim. I let him tell his lies and enjoy his stolen reputation. But in my private life, I was building a case. Every few weeks, I would meet with Daniel to review his progress. Slowly but surely, he was pulling back the layers of my father's financial life, and the things he found were staggering. 6 months after I hired him, Daniel called me into his office for a final review. He had a massive stack of binders sitting on his desk. He looked at me and said he had finally pieced the entire puzzle together. The first major discovery was the most devastating. Daniel had managed to pull the official probate records and requested a copy of my grandfather's will, the exact document my dad had used to claim the entire estate. Daniel did not just read it, he sent it out to an independent handwriting expert for a forensic analysis. The expert compared the signature on the will to dozens of historical documents my grandfather had signed over the last 20 years. The result was definitive. The signature on the will was completely faked. It was not Arthur's handwriting. My dad had forged the will to make himself the sole beneficiary, effectively stealing the entire inheritance from the rest of the family. but that was just the beginning. Daniel then moved on to the money itself. Once my dad had legally seized control of the accounts using the fake will, he did not just let the money sit there. He immediately started draining it. Daniel's forensic tracing showed that over the past few months, my dad had aggressively withdrawn $480,000 from the estate accounts. Almost $500,000 of my grandfather's life savings had been moved in a matter of weeks that I sat in Daniel's office, staring at the bank statements he slid across the desk, feeling sick to my stomach. I asked him where all that money went. Daniel opened another folder and showed me the paper trail that my dad was trying to hide the assets, and he was not doing it alone. Daniel tracked a massive wire transfer of $150,000. The money had been moved from the estate account directly into a brand new, completely secret bank account. I looked at the name on the account and felt the air leave my lungs. The account belonged to my mother, Marilyn.my mom, the quiet woman who had sat in the living room after the funeral and nodded along while my dad claimed everything. She knew. She was actively participating in the theft. She was holding $150,000 of stolen inheritance in a hidden account under her own name. The realization that my mother was fully complicit in this crime broke something inside me. It was no longer just my dad acting alone. My parents were working together to steal my grandfather's legacy. Finally, Daniel pointed to another series of transactions. Over the course of a few weeks, my dad had made a series of massive cash withdrawals. In total, $60,000 in pure, untraceable cash had completely vanished. There were no receipts, no wire transfers, and no paper trails for this money. He had simply walked into the bank, taken the cash, and hidden it somewhere. Daniel closed the folders. The evidence was overwhelming. We had proof of a forged equity loan. We had proof of a forged will. We had proof of $480,000 being siphoned out of the estate. We had proof of my mother hiding $150,000. And we had $60,000 in missing cash that I now had exactly what I needed to prove my dad was a criminal. But Daniel looked at me and said there was still one piece missing. We had the financial proof of the theft, but if we really wanted to destroy my dad's fake narrative in front of a judge, we needed to know what my grandfather actually wanted to do with his money before he died. We needed to find the real will. Daniel Crow looked at me across his desk, tapping his pen against the thick folder of financial evidence we had just reviewed. We had all the bank statements, the forged signatures, and the paper trail of the stolen money, but Daniel made it very clear that we were missing one crucial piece of the puzzle. If my dad had presented a forged will to the probate court to steal my grandfather's estate, that meant a real will had to exist somewhere. My grandfather was a meticulous man, and there was absolutely no way he would have died without putting his true final wishes down on paper. That I left Daniel's office that afternoon and sat in my car, staring at the steering wheel. I racked my brain, trying to think of anyone Grandpa Arthur trusted enough to hold on to something as important as his last will and testament. He obviously would not have given it to my dad, and he clearly did not leave it in his own house where anyone could easily find it and destroy it. Then, a name suddenly popped into my head. I needed to find Margaret Doyle, my grandfather's younger sister. Aunt Margaret lived a few towns over, about a 2-hour drive from Cedar Hollow. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had always kept her distance from our immediate family. I suddenly remembered why she never came around for the holidays. Margaret never liked my dad. She was one of the few people who saw right through his loud, boastful personality, and she always warned my grandfather that Victor was financially reckless. If Grandpa Arthur had a secret he needed to protect from his own son, Margaret was exactly the person he would give it to. I did not even bother calling ahead. I just started the engine and drove out to her property. When I pulled up to her small farmhouse, she was sitting on the front porch with a cup of tea. She looked surprised to see me, but she waved me inside. We sat down in her living room, and I did not waste any time with small talk. I told her absolutely everything. That I explained how my dad had claimed the entire estate immediately after the funeral. I told her about the forged will he used to take control of the assets, the massive cash withdrawals, and the secret bank account my mother had opened. Finally, I told her about the vicious rumors my dad was spreading around town, telling my church and my hospital that I had stolen money from Arthur's safe. Margaret did not look shocked. Instead, her face tightened with a cold, absolute fury. She set her teacup down, so hard it rattled against the saucer. She told me she always knew Victor was a greedy man, but she never imagined he would sink low enough to frame his own daughter for his crimes. Then, she stood up without saying another word and walked down the hallway to her bedroom. When she came back, she was holding a heavy, sealed manila envelope. She sat back down across from me and placed it on the coffee table. She told me that Arthur had come to her house exactly 7 years ago to drop this off. He had sat in the exact chair I was sitting in and told her that he did not trust Victor to handle his estate fairly. He knew Victor was constantly drowning in business debts, and he was terrified that his oldest son would blow the family savings and leave the rest to the grandchildren with nothing. Margaret opened the envelope and handed me the original, legally notarized document. It was the real will, drafted and signed 7 years ago. I read through the pages, my eyes scanning the legal jargon until I found the section detailing the distribution of his assets. The truth was right there in black and white. The estate was never supposed to go to my dad. Grandpa Arthur had explicitly written that all of his assets, including the farm, the rental properties, and the cash, were to be divided equally among his 4 grandchildren. Victor was given a small, symbolic sum, but the bulk of the life savings was meant to ensure that my generation had a solid foundation. Margaret had kept this original copy locked away in her personal safe, completely untouched, waiting for the right moment that I held the thick parchment paper in my hands, feeling a massive weight lift off my chest. We finally had the smoking gun. We had the definitive proof that my father had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from his own family. I thanked Margaret, carefully packed the real will into my bag, and drove back home feeling more empowered than I had in 12 years. But even with the financial records and the real will in my possession, I still felt a lingering sense of anxiety. We had proof of the theft, but my dad was a master manipulator. I knew that when we finally dragged him into court, he would lie, twist the truth, and probably try to blame my mother or claim it was all a giant misunderstanding. I needed undeniable proof of his malicious intent. I needed proof that he knew exactly what he was doing to me. That I got that proof late one night, in the most unexpected way possible. It was almost midnight, and I was sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing the case files, when my phone suddenly vibrated. The caller ID showed it was my younger brother, Caleb. Caleb still lived at home with my parents. He was a quiet guy, always keeping his head down to avoid our dad's explosive temper. Because he had never stood up for me when the rumors started, I naturally assumed he had taken my parents' side. I hesitated for a second, wondering if my dad had put him up to calling me, but I eventually swiped the screen and answered. Caleb's voice was barely a whisper. He sounded completely terrified. He asked me if I was alone and if I could talk. I told him I was just at my apartment. He took a deep, shaky breath and told me that he had not been able to sleep, so he had gone downstairs to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he heard my parents talking in hushed tones in the dining room. Caleb stayed hidden in the shadows of the hallway and listened. He quickly realized they were talking about me, the inheritance, and the money they had been moving around. Realizing how serious the conversation was, Caleb pulled his phone out of his pocket and hit the record button. He told me he was going to play the audio for me over the phone. A second later, the sound of static filled my ear, followed by the unmistakable voices of my mother and father. Did I end the recording? My mother sounded nervous. She was asking my dad what would happen if I actually hired a lawyer and started looking into the estate. She asked him if they had covered their tracks well enough with the bank transfers. Then, my dad's voice came through the speaker, loud, arrogant, and dripping with absolute contempt. "She can't prove anything," Victor sneered on the recording. "If she fights back, we just make sure everyone thinks she's the thief." I sat frozen in my chair, the phone pressed hard against my ear. Hearing it secondhand was one thing, but actually listening to my own father proudly admit to framing me as a criminal to cover up his theft was a completely different level of betrayal. He was not just a desperate man making bad choices. He was actively, ruthlessly trying to destroy my life to protect his stolen money. Caleb stopped the playback. He was crying quietly on the other end of the line. He told me he was so sorry for not speaking up earlier, but he had been too scared of our dad to say anything. He promised to send me the audio file immediately and told me to use it to do whatever I had to do. A few seconds later, my phone pinged with a text message containing the audio attachment. That I downloaded the file and saved it to 3 different hard drives. I now had everything. I had the forged documents, the bank statements tracking the stolen money, the real will from Margaret, and a crystal-clear audio confession of my parents conspiring to ruin my life, the trap was finally fully constructed. Now, I just needed to hire the right lawyer to help me spring it. The morning after my younger brother Caleb sent me that audio file, I did not even bother trying to go to sleep. I just sat at my kitchen table, drinking black coffee, listening to my parents' voices on repeat, hearing my dad confidently state that they would just frame me as a thief if I tried to fight back completely erased any lingering guilt I had about what I was going to do to them. As soon as the sun came up, I called Daniel Crow, my financial investigator. I told him we finally had the intent on tape. Daniel immediately told me that his part of the job was done, and it was time to hand this massive pile of evidence over to a legal professional. Daniel gave me the name of the absolute best estate and fraud litigator in our state. His name was Jonathan Pierce. I called his office the exact same day, took an emergency personal day off from my grueling shifts at the hospital ICU, and drove straight into the city to meet him. Jonathan Pierce was an older, incredibly sharp attorney who did not waste a single second with small talk. I walked into his high-end office, sat down in a heavy leather chair across from his massive mahogany desk, and started pulling everything out of my bag. I laid out the entire 12-year timeline of financial abuse. I showed him the paperwork for the forged home equity loan my dad had taken out in my name. I showed him the bank statements Daniel had uncovered, proving my dad had illegally withdrawn $480,000 from the estate accounts. Then, I pulled out the real will that my grandfather Arthur had written 7 years ago, the one my Aunt Margaret had kept hidden in her safe. Finally, I played the audio recording of my parents conspiring against me in their dining room. I watched Jonathan's jaw physically tighten as he listened to my father's cruel, arrogant voice. When the recording finished, Jonathan sat back in his chair and stared at me. He told me that in his 30 years of practicing law, he had seen a lot of greedy families fight over money, but he had rarely seen a case of family fraud so brazen, vicious, and recklessly executed. Jonathan immediately got to work preparing our legal strategy, systematically organizing my evidence into an undeniable, bulletproof legal dossier. He started by compiling the forensic signature analysis, which definitively proved my dad had faked my grandfather's handwriting on the forged will. Next, he attached the comprehensive financial report that detailed exactly where the stolen $480,000 had gone, including the secret account holding my mother's $150,000. After that, he included legally certified copies of the real will. Finally, he added a fully transcribed, hard copy of the audio recording between my parents. Jonathan carefully slid all of these damning documents into one massive, thick envelope. He placed the thick envelope on the desk between us and looked me dead in the eye. He told me we had more than enough to file a massive lawsuit. He wanted to go to the probate court that exact afternoon to file an emergency injunction to freeze every single one of my dad's bank accounts. He also wanted to file a formal police report for the forged signature on the equity loan. It was the smart, standard, aggressive legal move, but I stopped him. I looked at that thick envelope sitting on his desk, and I told him I wanted to wait. Jonathan thought I was completely crazy. He warned me that every single day we waited, my dad could be spending more of the stolen cash, making it harder to recover. But I explained to Jonathan that this was no longer just about recovering the money. This was about my life, my reputation, and the 12 years of absolute financial hell my father had put me through. My dad hadn't just quietly stolen my inheritance. He had gone out of his way to actively poison my entire town against me, that he had maliciously told the people at my church, the nurses at my hospital, and every single one of our 40 relatives that I was a despicable thief who stole from an elderly man. If I just quietly filed a lawsuit in a courtroom behind closed doors, the legal system would eventually handle it, but the vicious rumors would never truly die. People in my small town would always whisper that maybe we just settled out of court, or maybe I had just found a sneaky legal loophole to get away with it. I needed to destroy his fake narrative exactly where he built it. Right in front of the entire family, I told Jonathan that our annual family Christmas dinner was just a few weeks away. Every single aunt, uncle, and cousin who had believed my dad's lies would be sitting in one room. It was the perfect stage. Jonathan stared at me for a long time, realizing the depth of the betrayal I had suffered and knowing I wasn't going to change my mind. Finally, he nodded. He agreed to draft the official court summons and have all the legal filings ready to go, but he allowed me to take the thick envelope containing all the undeniable proof. He told me to drop the bomb at the dinner, and he would file the injunctions the very next morning when the courts opened. The next few weeks leading up to the holidays were the hardest weeks of my entire life. I had to play the part of the defeated, humiliated daughter. Every time I saw my parents, I forced myself to keep my eyes on the floor. I let my dad make snide little comments about my financial struggles, completely biting my tongue. I watched him buy a brand new luxury truck with what I knew was my grandfather's stolen money. I watched my mother smile warmly at me, knowing she had a massive chunk of stolen inheritance sitting in a secret account in her name. It took every ounce of self-control I had not to scream that I also stayed in very close contact with my brother, Caleb. I told him the entire plan. I told him exactly what was going to happen at the dinner, and I explicitly warned him to keep his head down and stay completely out of the crossfire. Caleb was terrified of our dad's explosive temper and the massive fallout that was coming, but he promised to keep my secret safe. He was the only person in that giant house who knew that a devastating storm was about to hit. Finally, the day arrived. It was Christmas Day, 2023. The weather was freezing, and a heavy blanket of snow was falling over our small mountain town of Cedar Hollow, Montana. I drove my old, beat-up car slowly through the icy streets toward my parents' massive, beautifully decorated house. My stomach was completely tied in knots, and my hands were actually shaking on the steering wheel. I parked in the long driveway, took a deep, steadying breath, and grabbed my bag. Inside that bag was the thick envelope Jonathan had prepared for me. It felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I walked up the front steps and pushed through the heavy wooden door. Instantly, the overwhelming noise of 40 relatives hit me like a physical wave. The house looked like something out of a magazine. The smell of roasted turkey, honey-baked ham, and fresh pine was everywhere. But the exact moment I stepped into the main living room, the festive atmosphere shifted dramatically. Conversations abruptly stopped. People turned their heads away from me. My aunts and uncles gave me tight, incredibly judgmental smiles before quickly walking in the opposite direction to avoid talking to me. They all fully believed the lie. Every single one of them looked at me and saw a desperate, broke woman who had ruthlessly robbed her dying grandfather. I forced myself to ignore the burning sensation in my chest. I walked straight into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood quietly in the corner, just observing that I watched my dad confidently work the room. Victor was completely in his element. He was laughing loudly, pouring expensive wine for his brothers, and soaking up the admiration and respect of the entire extended family. He looked like an untouchable king holding court in his castle. He had absolutely no idea that I was carrying a legal guillotine in my purse. When it was finally time to eat, everyone naturally moved into the massive dining room. 40 people took their respective seats around the huge, custom-built oak table and the supplementary tables set up in the adjoining room. I was seated near the middle, right across from a younger cousin who refused to even make basic eye contact with me. My dad confidently took his designated place right at the head of the long table. He stood up, picked up a spoon, and tapped it loudly against his crystal wine glass to get everyone's attention. The loud, chaotic room went completely silent. Every single person turned their head to look at the patriarch of the family. I reached down under the table, slowly unzipped my bag, and rested my hand firmly on the thick envelope containing the signature analysis, the financial reports, the real will, and the transcript of the audio recording. My heart was hammering against my ribs, so incredibly hard I thought the person sitting next to me could actually hear it. I stared straight ahead at my father, waiting for him to make his move. This was it. The trap was perfectly set, the evidence was completely secured, and the audience was completely captive. My dad tapped his silver spoon against his crystal wine glass, and the loud, chaotic dining room went completely silent. Every single person stopped talking, stopped chewing, and turned their heads to look at him. My dad stood at the head of the long oak table, looking like a grieving, heartbroken son. He cleared his throat and started talking about how difficult this year had been for our family since Grandpa Arthur passed away in May at the age of 87. He talked about family unity and honesty. It was a sickening performance. He looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with his brothers, sisters, and nieces. Then his eyes finally locked onto me, sitting quietly near the middle of the table. The fake warmth completely vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, hard stare. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick red envelope. He tossed it down the table, and it slid right in front of my dinner plate. He looked around at the 40 relatives gathered in the room and said the words he had been practicing. "My daughter stole money from my father," he announced, his voice booming through the massive room. He pointed at the red envelope sitting in front of me and told everyone it was an official court summons. He claimed he had finally gathered enough proof to take me to court for draining Grandpa Arthur's safe. The entire room turned on me in a matter of seconds. My aunts gasped out loud. My uncles shook their heads in absolute disgust. The younger cousin sitting across from me actually pushed her chair back, physically distancing herself from me as if I had a contagious disease. Everyone was staring at me with pure judgment and anger. My dad had effectively turned our annual Christmas dinner into a family courtroom, and he had just publicly declared me guilty in front of every single person I cared about. He expected me to cry. He expected me to grab my coat, run out the front door, and never come back. I did not run. I did not even flinch. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The room was so incredibly quiet that you could hear the snow hitting the windows outside. I reached into my heavy bag resting on the floor and pulled out the massive, thick envelope my lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, had prepared for me. It was twice the size of my dad's fake red envelope. I slammed it down on the table right next to his. The heavy thud made a few people jump. I looked my dad dead in the eye and spoke loudly enough for all 40 people to hear clearly. "If you want the truth in front of the whole family," I said, my voice completely steady, "then I have a few things I want to share too." My dad frowned, looking slightly confused, but he kept his arrogant posture. I opened my envelope and pulled out the first stack of legal papers. I held them up for the room to see. I explained that I had not been sitting quietly for the last 6 months while these vicious rumors destroyed my life. I told them I had hired a forensic financial investigator to look into the estate. That I slid the first document down the table toward my oldest uncle, David. I told the room that this was a legally certified forensic signature analysis. I explained exactly what that meant. I told them the investigator had taken the will my dad used to claim the entire estate and sent it to an independent handwriting expert. The expert compared it to 20 years of Grandpa Arthur's historical documents. The conclusion was absolute. The signature on the will my dad submitted to the probate court was completely faked. It did not belong to Arthur. The silence in the room shifted from shock to deep confusion. Uncle David picked up the report, pulled his reading glasses out of his pocket, and started reading the expert's conclusion. His face went pale. He handed the paper to the aunt sitting next to him. My dad's face instantly turned bright red. He slammed his hands on the table and yelled that I was lying. He shouted that I had faked the report to cover up my own theft. He demanded that everyone ignore me and told me to get out of his house, but I completely ignored him. I reached back into my thick envelope and pulled out the second piece of evidence. I held up a heavy, notarized parchment paper. "This," I said, projecting my voice over his shouting, "is the real will." I looked around the table at my relatives, who were now staring at the document in my hand instead of looking at my dad. I told them that Grandpa Arthur had written this real will exactly 7 years ago. He had taken it to Aunt Margaret, his younger sister, and asked her to lock it in her personal safe. I explained that Arthur did this because he explicitly did not trust Victor to handle the estate fairly. Arthur knew Victor was drowning in business debts and was terrified Victor would steal everything. That I opened the real will and read the distribution clause out loud so there could be no misunderstanding. I told the room that the 40-acre farm, the 2 rental properties, and the massive cash savings were never supposed to go to my dad. Grandpa Arthur had explicitly written that the estate was to be divided equally among all 4 of his grandchildren. The room erupted into chaotic whispers. My cousins, who just minutes ago had been looking at me with pure disgust, were now looking at my dad with absolute shock. They suddenly realized that my dad had not just stolen from me, he had actively stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from them too. He had taken their inheritances to fund his own lifestyle. My dad was losing control of the room, and he knew it. He started aggressively pointing at me, yelling that Margaret was a bitter old woman, and that the document I was holding was a complete fabrication. He tried to physically walk around the massive oak table to snatch the papers out of my hands, but Uncle David stood up and blocked his path. David demanded to see the real will. I handed it over, and within seconds, Several aunts and uncles were crowding around David, reading Grandpa Arthur's actual final wishes with their own eyes. My mother, Marilyn, was sitting near the head of the table. She had not said a single word. She was gripping her cloth napkin so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She looked absolutely terrified. She knew what was coming next. I told the room that my dad had not just forged the will to take control of the assets. I told them he had immediately started draining the accounts the second the ink was dry. I reached into my envelope for the third time and pulled out a massive stack of bank statements. These were the detailed financial tracking reports my investigator, Daniel Crow, had compiled over 6 long months. That I threw the thick stack of bank statements onto the middle of the dining table. I told my family to look at the highlighted numbers. I explained that over the past few months, my dad had illegally and aggressively withdrawn $480,000 from the estate accounts. Almost $500,000 of my grandfather's life savings had vanished into thin air. My uncle scrambled to grab the bank statements, flipping through the pages and seeing the massive, undeniable withdrawals printed in black and white. "But that is not all," I said, my voice cutting through the rising panic in the room. I turned and looked directly at my mother. She actually shrank back in her chair. I told the family that my dad did not hide this money alone. I explained that my investigator tracked a massive wire transfer of $150,000. The money went directly from the estate into a brand new, completely secret bank account. That I paused for a second, making sure everyone was listening. Then I dropped the next bomb. I told them the secret account holding the stolen $150,000 was registered under my mother's name. The entire dining room gasped collectively. My mother burst into tears and covered her face with her hands. She did not even try to deny it. Her reaction alone was a massive admission of guilt. My dad screamed at her to stop crying and shut up, completely losing his confident, patriarchal persona. He was sweating profusely, his face purple with rage. Looking like a cornered animal, he looked at the 40 people in the room, realizing they were all turning against him. He desperately tried one last tactic. He pointed at me again and yelled that even if he moved the money, it didn't change the fact that I had stolen cash directly from Arthur's safe. He told the family I was just a bitter, broke woman trying to ruin his life because of my own financial failures. That I just smiled a cold, hard smile. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. It was time for the final nail in the coffin. The transition from a festive, warm family gathering to a hostile interrogation room was completely jarring. The smell of roasted turkey and fresh pine was completely overpowered by the heavy, suffocating tension in the air. My younger brother, Caleb, who had been the one to give me the ultimate piece of evidence, was sitting quietly at the far end of the table. He kept his head down, staring at his plate, exactly like I told him to do. He was staying completely out of the crossfire while our parents' world crumbled around them. My Aunt Sarah, who had known me since I was a baby, picked up one of the bank statements showing the massive cash withdrawals. She looked at the paper, then looked at my dad, her face twisted in pure betrayal. She asked him directly if it was true. She asked him if he really stole the money meant for his own nieces and nephews. Victor refused to answer her directly. Instead, he just kept aggressively shifting the blame back to me, repeating his tired lies about me stealing from the safe. He sounded like a broken record, and absolutely no one was buying it anymore. The hard, undeniable paperwork was sitting right in front of them. You cannot argue with legally certified forensic analysis, and you cannot argue with official bank transaction records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars moving into secret accounts. I stood there at the table, feeling a profound sense of vindication wash over me. For 12 years, this man had financially abused me. He had ruined my credit, destroyed my chances of buying a home, and kept me trapped in cheap rental apartments. For the last 6 months, he had actively poisoned my reputation in our small mountain town, making me a pariah at my church and my hospital. He had done all of it with a smug, arrogant smile on his face, but not anymore. The smile was completely gone. The untouchable king of the family was currently hyperventilating at the head of the table, his lies completely exposed for everyone to see. I had brought the truth directly to the people he had manipulated, and I was about to play the one piece of evidence he could never, ever talk his way out of. I unlocked my phone screen and opened the audio file Caleb had sent me. I connected my phone to a small, portable Bluetooth speaker I had brought in my bag specifically for this exact moment. I placed the small, cylindrical Bluetooth speaker right in the middle of the massive oak dining table, resting it directly next to the thick stack of financial reports and the legally certified real will. My dad, Victor, stopped yelling and just stared at the little black device, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He had absolutely no idea what I was about to play, but the sheer panic in his wide eyes told me he knew it was going to be the final, devastating blow. I looked around the room at my 40 relatives, making sure every single one of them was paying attention. Then, without breaking eye contact with my father, I pressed play on my phone at a brief second of electronic static hiss through the speaker, echoing loudly in the incredibly tense dining room. Then, my mother's voice filled the air. On the recording, Marilyn sounded incredibly nervous and shaky. She was asking Victor what would happen if I actually hired a lawyer and started looking into Grandpa Arthur's estate. She explicitly asked him if they had covered their tracks well enough with the massive bank transfers. My mother, sitting just a few feet away from me at the head of the table, let out a loud, pathetic sob and buried her face in her arms, unable to even look at the family. Then, my dad's voice came through the speaker. It was loud, arrogant, and dripping with absolute contempt. "She can't prove anything," Victor's recorded voice sneered, perfectly clear for every single person in the room to hear. "If she fights back, we just make sure everyone thinks she's a thief." Did I hit pause on my phone, and the audio cut out, leaving the massive dining room completely dead silent. The silence was so absolute, so incredibly suffocating, that it felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the house. No one moved. No one spoke. The 40 relatives who had gathered for a festive holiday dinner just sat there, frozen in pure shock, processing the sheer, calculated malice of what they had just heard. That it is one thing to see forged financial documents and bank statements. People can try to wrap their heads around greed. But hearing a father proudly and confidently admit to framing his own daughter for a crime, actively plotting to destroy her reputation just to cover up his own theft, was a level of evil that no one in that room was prepared for. Uncle David was the first person to break the silence. He slowly took off his reading glasses and threw them down onto the table. He looked at my dad not with anger, but with absolute, unfiltered disgust. David had known Victor his entire life. They had grown up together, worked together, and trusted each other. Now, David was looking at his brother like he was a complete monster. He asked Victor, his voice shaking with quiet fury, how he could possibly do something so incredibly vile to his own flesh and blood. Victor panicked. The smooth, confident patriarch persona was completely shattered. He started stammering, his hands shaking violently as he tried to come up with another lie. He pointed at the speaker and stuttered that the audio was taken out of context. He tried to claim that I had somehow manipulated the recording, or that they were talking about something else entirely. But the excuses were incredibly weak, pathetic, and utterly useless. He was drowning, and every single person at that table was watching him sink. Then, the younger generation erupted. My older cousin, Marcus, the exact same cousin who had refused to even look at me when I walked into the house, stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair crashed backward onto the hardwood floor. He slammed his hands on the table and demanded that the entire estate file be legally reopened immediately. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Victor's face and yelled that the stolen $480,000 belonged to all of the grandchildren. He demanded to know exactly where his share of the inheritance was, and he swore loudly that he was going to hire his own legal team to tear Victor's finances apart. The dam completely broke. Suddenly, half a dozen cousins were shouting at once, demanding their stolen inheritances and threatening massive legal action. The aunts who had given me tight, judgmental smiles just an hour ago were now actively screaming at my mother, demanding to know how she could sit there and let her husband destroy her daughter's life while hiding $150,000 in a secret account. The noise was absolutely deafening. The festive Christmas dinner had officially turned into a brutal, chaotic interrogation, and Victor was trapped right in the center of it. I just stood there, quietly watching the empire he had built on lies crumble to the ground in a matter of minutes. I didn't need to say another word. The undeniable evidence I had laid out on the table was doing all the work for me. My Aunt Sarah, tears streaming down her face, grabbed her purse from the back of her chair. She looked at my parents with pure revulsion, stated that she felt physically sick being in the same house as them, and turned toward the hallway. That was the exact moment my relatives started to stand up and walk away from the table, completely abandoning the dinner. It was a mass exodus. Uncles, aunts, and cousins aggressively grabbed their coats, scarves, and bags. They didn't bother packing up the gifts they had brought. They didn't even look at the massive, expensive holiday feast my mother had spent 3 days cooking. They just wanted to get as far away from my parents as physically possible. The sound of 40 people angrily shuffling through the house, slamming the heavy front door one by one as they marched out into the freezing snow, was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Victor ran into the hallway, desperately grabbing his brothers by the arms, begging them to stay, pleading with them to just listen to his side of the story. But they literally shoved him away. Uncle David looked Victor dead in the eye, told him he no longer had a brother, and walked out into the cold. Within 15 minutes, the massive, chaotic house was completely empty, except for me, Caleb, and my ruined parents. That I slowly packed my legal documents, the forged signature analysis, the real will, and the bank statements back into my heavy bag. I zipped it up, swung it over my shoulder, and finally looked at my dad. He was standing in the hallway, staring at the closed front door, looking completely hollowed out. The arrogant, boastful man who had called me a thief 30 minutes ago was completely gone. That I knew exactly what was going to happen next. In a small mountain town like Cedar Hollow, news travels faster than a wildfire. The 40 angry relatives who just walked out of this house were going to talk. By tomorrow morning, the entire church would know exactly what he had done. The nurses at my hospital would know the truth. Every single person at the grocery store, the local diner, and the bank would know that Victor Hart was a fraud, a thief, and a manipulative liar. In a matter of minutes, Victor completely lost his reputation in our small town, and he was never, ever going to get it back. That I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. I just walked past him, opened the front door, and stepped out into the crisp, freezing mountain air. I got into my old, beat-up car, turned the heater on high, and drove away from that house for the very last time, leaving the wreckage of my father's life squarely in my rearview mirror. But the war wasn't completely over yet. The court system was waiting, and I was about to take everything back. The morning after the disastrous Christmas dinner, I woke up in my small, cramped rental apartment to the sound of my phone vibrating relentlessly against my nightstand. It was barely 7 o'clock in the morning on December 26th. I rolled over and looked at the screen. I had 14 missed calls and over 30 unread text messages. They were from cousins, aunts, and even a few family friends who hadn't spoken to me in months. The mass exodus of my relatives from my parents' house the night before had done exactly what I knew it would do. The truth had escaped the dining room and was currently burning through our small mountain town of Cedar Hollow like a massive, uncontrollable wildfire. That I opened a text from my aunt, who apologized profusely for ever believing my dad's malicious lies, and she told me that the extended family was already organizing a massive group text to coordinate their own legal actions against him. I scrolled down and saw messages from people at my church, the exact same place where my dad had actively spread the terrible rumors about me taking money from an old man's safe. The women who had given me the cold shoulder after Sunday services were now sending paragraphs of apologies, saying they were absolutely horrified by what Victor and Marilyn had done. The fake narrative my dad had spent 6 months carefully constructing to destroy my reputation at the church, the hospital, and the grocery store was completely obliterated overnight. He was no longer the grieving, respectable patriarch of the Hart family. He had completely lost his reputation in our small town, but the social vindication, as satisfying as it was only the very first step. I didn't take the day off to rest. By 8:30 that morning, I was already sitting in the sleek, quiet office of my attorney, Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan had a massive stack of official, legally binding documents sitting on his mahogany desk, fully prepared for the battle ahead. He looked at me, asked how the dinner went, and gave a rare, grim smile when I told him about the relatives walking out into the snow. But Jonathan was a professional, and he knew we had a tiny, incredibly critical window of time to act before my dad could try to hide any more of the stolen cash. While my dad was likely sitting in his empty house panicking about his ruined social standing, Jonathan and I were executing the legal equivalent of a nuclear strike. We drove directly to the county courthouse. Jonathan walked up to the clerk's window and filed an emergency injunction to immediately freeze every single bank account associated with Victor and Marilyn Hart. He presented the judge with the massive legal dossier we had prepared. He showed the legally certified forensic signature analysis proving the will was a total forgery. He laid out the financial reports showing the aggressive theft of $480,000 from the estate. Finally, he provided the undeniable proof of the secret bank account holding my mother's $150,000. The judge took one look at the overwhelming mountain of evidence and signed the emergency order without a single moment of hesitation. By noon that exact same day, my parents were entirely locked out of their own finances. They could not move a single dollar. They could not withdraw cash. They couldn't even use their debit cards to buy a cup of coffee. The stolen money was completely trapped, but we did not stop at the civil courthouse. We left the judge's chambers and drove straight to the local police precinct. The inheritance theft was a probate issue, but the $75,000 home equity loan my dad had secretly taken out in my name 12 years into my financial nightmare was a straight-up felony. I sat in a small interrogation room with a financial crimes detective and handed over the bank records. I explained how my dad had completely forged my signature on official banking documents to borrow against the equity of the house I was legally tied to without ever asking for my permission. The detective took copies of everything, including the audio recording of my father explicitly stating he would frame me as a thief if I fought back, and officially opened a criminal fraud investigation. When I finally got back to my apartment that evening, I felt completely exhausted but incredibly light. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had completely crushed him. Over the next few weeks, my dad's life completely unraveled at a terrifying speed. Because his bank accounts were entirely frozen by the judge's emergency injunction, he had absolutely no money to hire a high-powered defense attorney to fight the massive pile of lawsuits coming his way. My older cousin and several other relatives made good on their threats at the dinner table. They formally requested to reopen the estate files and hired their own aggressive lawyers to file massive suits against Victor. My dad was drowning in legal paperwork, and he had no life raft if he tried to contact me, of course. My phone would ring constantly with his number popping up on the screen. When I refused to answer, he started leaving long, frantic voicemails. The tone of his voice would swing wildly from one extreme to the other. In one message, he would be screaming, threatening to countersue me for defamation. In the very next voicemail, his voice would break, and he would be begging and crying, pleading with me to drop the injunctions and settle this as a family behind closed doors. That I listened to every single voicemail, but I never texted back, and I never picked up the phone. There was absolutely nothing left to say. I had spent 12 years dealing with the consequences of his actions, watching my credit score sit at a miserable 540 while I missed out on buying my own home. Now, the tables were entirely turned, and I was going to let the justice system handle him. 3 months later, the probate court officially reopened Grandpa Arthur's estate. The hearing was incredibly brief because the evidence was absolutely insurmountable. The judge formally reviewed the original, legally notarized will that Aunt Margaret had kept hidden in her safe. He listened to the damning audio recording of my dad confidently plotting to destroy my life. He reviewed the financial tracking that showed exactly where the stolen funds had gone. The ruling was absolute and devastating for Victor. The judge officially threw out the forged will and legally ordered Victor to return the stolen assets. The estate was ordered to be divided equally among the 4 grandchildren, exactly as Grandpa Arthur had originally written in his real will, but there was a massive logistical problem. My dad had already spent a significant portion of the cash, and the investigators were still trying to track down the $60,000 in untraceable cash that had completely vanished. Because he could not physically return the full liquid amount, the court had to take extreme measures to make the estate whole again. The judge slammed his gavel and ordered the forced liquidation of the physical properties. The 2 rental properties that generated passive income were seized. But the biggest blow was the land itself. Grandpa Arthur's beautiful 40-acre farm, the exact property my dad had so proudly strutted around acting like he owned, was officially ordered to be put up for public auction. The proceeds from the massive land sale would be used to forcefully repay the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had stolen from his own family. Victor was forced to sit in the courtroom and listen as the judge systematically dismantled his entire life. The $150,000 sitting in my mother's secret bank account, was immediately seized and wired back into the legal estate trust. My parents were left with absolutely nothing but the massive legal fees they couldn't afford to pay and the crushing realization that they had lost everything. I sat in the back row of the courtroom, watching the bailiff hand my dad a massive stack of finalized court orders. His shoulders were slumped, his face was pale, and the arrogant, untouchable aura he had carried at that Christmas dinner was completely gone. The court had officially forced him to pay for his greed, and my 12-year nightmare was finally coming to an end. The gavel had slammed down, and the judge's orders were absolute, but untangling a massive financial fraud takes time. Over the next several months, the reality of the court's decision systematically dismantled whatever was left of my father's life. The public auction of Grandpa Arthur's 40-acre farm was the final, humiliating blow for Victor. The farm was the crown jewel of the estate, the exact property my dad had used to parade around our small mountain town, acting like a wealthy landowner. Now, a massive, bright red auction sign sat at the end of the dirt driveway for everyone in Cedar Hollow to see. The entire town knew exactly why the land was being sold off. The proceeds from that sale, along with the liquidation of the 2 rental properties and the recovery of the $150,000 hidden in my mother's secret bank account, were all funneled directly back into the court-mandated estate trust. Once the properties were fully liquidated and the cash was legally secured, the court's forensic accountants went to work. They had to untangle the massive mess my dad had made, deducting the exorbitant legal fees and accounting for the money he had already foolishly spent on his luxury truck and his own selfish lifestyle. It took weeks of meticulous calculations, but they finally arrived at the final, legally binding distribution number. Grandpa Arthur's true will dictated that the estate be divided equally among his 4 grandchildren. When the final math was done, the court issued official bank checks. Every single one of the 4 grandchildren received exactly $105,000. I remember the exact afternoon I went to my lawyer's office to pick up my check. Jonathan Pierce handed me the thick paper envelope, the total opposite of the fake red summons my dad had thrown at me at Christmas dinner. I sat in my car in the parking lot, staring at a legally certified check for $105,000. I did not cry, but my hands were shaking. This was not just money. It was the physical proof that I had fought back and won. It was my grandfather's actual, intended legacy, rescued directly from the hands of a greedy, manipulative man who had tried to steal our futures. My cousins, including Marcus, who had aggressively demanded the estate be reopened that night at the dining table, received their identical checks the exact same week. My younger brother, Caleb, also received his full share. With his inheritance secured, Caleb finally had the financial means to pack his bags, move out of my parents' house, and start his own life far away from our dad's explosive temper. As for Victor and Marilyn, their punishment was absolute. They received absolutely nothing from the final distribution. Their bank accounts had been decimated by the court seizures and their own mounting legal defense fees. They lost the farm, they lost the rental income, and they lost their entire social standing. The extended family completely excommunicated them. Uncle David, Aunt Sarah, and all the others who had walked out into the freezing snow on Christmas night never spoke to them again. Victor was officially a pariah in Cedar Hollow. The man who had spent 6 months maliciously spreading rumors at my hospital, my church, and the local grocery store, trying to brand me as a thief who stole from the elderly, was now internationally known by the entire town as a real criminal. He was the man who forged documents and stole from his own children, but I honestly stopped caring about Victor's misery. I had my own life to rebuild. For 12 long, grueling years, I had been trapped in a financial nightmare because I trusted my father and co-signed that original mortgage loan. Now, the chains were completely broken. The criminal fraud investigation into the $75,000 home equity loan my dad had forged in my name was fully underway, and the banks were legally forced to sever my name from that fraudulent debt. With my name finally cleared from his financial ruin, and the $105,000 inheritance safely deposited into my own completely secure bank account, I aggressively went to work fixing the damage he had done to me. I paid off every single small debt I had accumulated while struggling to survive on a nurse's salary with a ruined financial profile. I hired a specialized credit repair agency to formally expunge the 12 years of late mortgage payments my dad had recklessly racked up. It did not happen overnight, but month by month, I watched the numbers on my financial portal climb. For over a decade, my credit score had been anchored at a miserable, embarrassing 540. But as the fraudulent debts were wiped clean and my true financial stability was reflected, that number started to soar. Within 8 months, I had completely rehabilitated my financial identity. My credit score officially hit a healthy, incredibly strong 720. For the first time since I graduated from nursing school, I was not a financial liability. I was a strong, independent woman with excellent credit and a massive down payment sitting in the bank. I no longer had to settle for cheap, cramped rental apartments managed by landlords who looked at me with suspicion. I called a local real estate agent and told her exactly what I was looking for. After just a few weeks of searching, I found the perfect place. I used the money from Grandpa Arthur's estate to buy a beautiful, cozy small house located just a few miles down the road from the hospital where I worked as an intensive care unit nurse. It had a small front porch, a quiet backyard, and absolutely zero connection to Victor Hart. Moving day was the quietest, most peaceful day of my entire life. I did not ask any relatives for help. I just hired a small moving crew, packed up my cheap rental apartment for the very last time, and drove to my new property. I unlocked the front door, walked onto the hardwood floors, and just breathed in the silence. Nobody was demanding money from me. Nobody was threatening my reputation. Nobody was lying to me. The house was entirely mine, bought and paid for with the money my grandfather had explicitly wanted me to have. I spent the first weekend unpacking boxes, organizing the kitchen, and setting up my new life. On Sunday afternoon, I opened the final cardboard box. Inside was a framed, black and white photograph of Grandpa Arthur. He was sitting on the porch of his old farmhouse, wearing his favorite worn-out work jacket, smiling a quiet, gentle smile. I took a hammer and a single nail, walked into the center of my new, brightly lit living room, and hung the picture of my grandfather right on the main wall. I stood back and looked at the photograph for a long time. I thought about the absolute hell of the last 12 years. I thought about the crushing weight of the debt, the vicious, hateful rumors that had poisoned my daily life, and the terrifying moment I stood up at that Christmas dinner, surrounded by 40 angry relatives, and laid out the undeniable proof of my father's crimes. It had been a brutal, exhausting war, but looking around my beautiful new home, I knew it was worth every single second of the fight. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat by the window watching the sun set over the mountains of Cedar Hollow. The town that had briefly turned against me now knew the absolute truth. My reputation as a dedicated, honest nurse was completely restored. I had a demanding, fulfilling career, a beautiful home, and a secure financial future. But the most valuable thing I gained wasn't the house, the $105,000, or the 720 credit score. The most valuable thing I gained was peace. As I sat in the quiet warmth of my own home, completely separated from the toxic manipulation and greed of my parents, I realized the ultimate victory. For the very first time in my entire life, I was finally living completely free, entirely unburdened and absolutely unbound by my family.